10 starting soon.
KXVS LP Stockton.
The Third City Podcast is a production of Third City Coalition. In our show, we examine case studies in urban development in Stockton and other cities like Stockton across the country, exploring their local and regional impacts. Individual efforts play a role in Third City development, and it starts with you.
Do you want to relive the golden days of Stockton? Join Nate Knott on Stockton Alive every first and third Monday at 6 p.m. Tune into thevoiceofstockton.org.
This is Barbara Barrigan-Parrilla with Delta Flows, a radio show by the Voice of Stockton and Restore the Delta. This is the weekly radio show where we discuss everything Delta related. The environment, water management, water quality, farming, history and culture, public events, recreation, Delta food, and the arts. Tune into Delta Flows on KXVS, the Voice of Stockton, streaming live on Facebook and YouTube at KXVS Radio.
KXVS on 92.1. Coming soon.
The views and opinions expressed in the following program do not necessarily reflect those of KXVS, the Voice of Stockton, or its parents, affiliates, management, and staff.
KXVS, the Voice of Stockton. It's time for Delta Flows with your host, Barbara Barrigan-Parrilla.
Thank you so much, Governor Don. Welcome to Delta Flows. This is the show that is about everything related to the Sacramento, San Joaquin, San Francisco Bay Delta estuary. And today we're really fortunate to have two terrific guests with us. We have with us first to my far left, James Motlow, who's the author of the book Bitter Melon, which is in its 6th edition. It is a book about the town of Locke at the north end of the Delta, and you also are part of the team for the Locke Management Association.
That is correct, Barbara. Thank you very much.
Great. We're so glad you're here. And immediately to my left is Stuart Walthall, who is chairman of the Locke Foundation and works on preservation of
Barbara.
the town. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much for having me and James.
Well,
Yeah.
we're really excited. Locke is such a treasure, and people don't realize sometimes at this end of the Delta how close it is, what a neat place it is, just even simply for photograph opportunities, if nothing else. So, James, I guess I would start with you. Maybe you
Sure.
can talk to us a little bit about the book
Sure.
and what you're working on with the Management Association
Oh,
presently.
sure. Well, first of all, Barbara, thank you. It's an absolute honor to be here with you. I applaud for all the courageous work that you're doing to save the Delta as a whole, which Locke is definitely part of.
Mm-hmm.
As you were saying, it's a destination point for everything from photographers to painters to poets to writers, and it's always been that historically. I grew up in Sacramento in the 1950s, and as I introduce in my book of how my father and I would take drives down the levee roads and how it was always quite so special, and then myself, when I actually was able to have the vast, great, good fortune to actually live in Locke. I moved there in 1970 and stayed there for about 10 years until 1980. Then I was blessed with luck again in 2010 to be able to return there, and it's currently my home, and it's a delightful place to live. I encourage all of your listeners to make that short 30-mile drive to Locke. It's easy to get to from here. Come take a look, become familiar with the town, become familiar with the history of the town. Enjoy, bring your camera, bring your kids. We have a variety of events. And, as you were saying, it's probably in California is the single standing best representative of what the Chinese experience was in California. And it's still there, standing. You can get a real good sense of that. There's the boarding house museum that's run by the state, as well as we have the Dailoy Gambling Museum, as the Junsun School that's there. And the Locke Foundation that Stuart's part of is also very much involved with bringing greater public awareness and preservation to the town.
So great. Stuart, can you tell us what is the work of the foundation, and what are some of your goals and projects presently?
Well, the mission statement of the Locke Foundation is to educate the public regarding the history and culture of Locke, and also promote the town of Locke, its business, and taking care of historic signage. And well, that was short, what I gave you for the mission, but what we actually do is a lot of stuff. James had mentioned the Locke Boarding House Museum. It is a unit of the California State Parks, but they're kind of broke. So the Locke Foundation pretty much runs the Boarding House Museum and pays for it. So we're open 4 days a week, Tuesday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And the job of the Locke Foundation is the only organization who's completely dedicated to the advocacy of the history and culture of Locke. So we have oral history program, archival, artifact materials to preserve the history. Locke is changing. You know, it's not a living Chinese community anymore. It's quite a bit like the Gold Rush country. So, and it will be. We do have 8 Chinese residents, 3 of whom are born and raised there.
Okay.
But really the town itself is switching to a historic town. So
How many residents are there total now in Locke?
about 70.
70 to 80, depending upon things.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And so the total was, right now it's about 10% Chinese?
About, I think we do have 8 Chinese residents.
Approximately that. 10% is a good estimate.
Okay,
Right.
okay. But so when it comes to managing then the town, we were talking a little bit before the show about how the management association, if there's property for sale, do you go back and notify first families that were tied originally to Locke so that they have an opportunity?
Yes, that's true. The Locke Management Association sends out on a list of approximately 400, I think Stuart knows, to not only residents and their families who once lived in Locke, but also interested parties. It's a way to just make everybody known that a piece of property is for sale in Locke, and then, of course, who's ever selling it, working with the realtor, sets a price, and then the price is agreed upon, and then it's sold.
So it's a little bit more restrictive than other cities.
The park in Locke, and also, too, I think for some of our listeners, we've kind of jumped into this conversation, but I think it'd be great if you could explain a little bit, what is that history of Locke? What makes Locke what it is, and what's so special about the fact that it was a Chinese community? Maybe if you could summarize it a little bit.
As the National Park Service says, Locke is the largest, most complete example of a rural agricultural Chinese American community in the United States. And it is known as not necessarily as a Chinatown, and I've been recently corrected on this. Chinatowns themselves are hooked, or were hooked, to other towns.
Right.
Whereas Locke is a freestanding community.
Okay.
It's a young Chinatown. The Chinese presence in California really began in 1849 and 50 with the gold rush, and then, of course, there was a lot of action when it came to the building of the Transcontinental Railroad and the building of the levees. Locke was founded in 1915, so it really is a young community. So it's special because, well, it's special for a whole lot of reasons. When you see it, when you come to town, I really encourage people coming to come to town to look at it, because it doesn't look like 1915. It looks like 1860. The kind of architecture that one sees, the balconies, the old leaning structures. It's really a trip back in time, and a lot of folks in Stockton don't even know it's there. A lot of people in Elk Grove, that's 15-minute drive, are not even aware of Locke. It's very special.
Well, to give an idea of how special Locke is, Stuart, that Locke has the unique designation of being on the National Register of Historical Landmarks, which is quite different than being on the National Register of Historical Places. There, I believe for California, there's a little over 2,000 recognized places of historical interest. For landmarks, it's quite different. There are only 145 landmarks like the Golden Gate Bridge, Hearst Castle. Locke is number 65 on that list. So within our area, besides the state capitol and such, you have this truly unique landmark that's honored by the National Landmark Registry. So to come back to the idea of how Locke got it started, actually in 1915, on October, I think the 7th of 1915, a fire occurred in the adjacent community of Walnut Grove. Walnut Grove was unique because at that point you had on the eastern side of the river, you had a Japanese community that butted up against to a Chinese community. Then you also had a Filipino community as well. On the that was the eastern side of the river. On the western side of the river, you had predominantly the white community of Walnut Grove. So the fire occurs, and to kind of get into the details, the group of Chinese who didn't really feel even welcome in their own Chinese community because they spoke a different dialect than the majority of the Chinese who lived in Walnut Grove, decided to negotiate with George W. Locke, who owned the land, to his descendants who owned the land, to be able to relocate a mile upriver to where he had a pear orchard. And they reached an agreement. They tore out approximately 14 acres of pear trees, and that began Locke. First, of course, you have Main Street, which was truly unique.
Right.
And that's really the beginning in 1915. The uniqueness of Locke was actually in a 1919 article written by the Sacramento Bee, called it the Montecarlo of California.
Wow.
And one of the unique things about this, which actually plays into very current topics about immigration here, because of the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act that forbid Chinese from becoming citizens of America. In Leslie Davis's article about the gambling that was taking place up and down the river, Locke was unique because it allowed, in his words, for Americans to be able to come into Locke and partake of the gambling. The other communities up and down the river, Isleton, Cortland, Walnut Grove, did not allow Americans. So one of the things that made Locke so attractive, and to give you an idea, if in the 20s, the early 20s, when Prohibition was going on, Locke would have over 2,000 people on a warm summer night, all coming from all parts, San Francisco, Stockton, San Francisco even, coming to Locke to partake of the various, amenities that the town had, which was then open to Americans, and it was truly unique, and it was, and it thrived on that.
That's interesting because people don't realize, especially I think maybe during Prohibition, how important the Delta was as an escape hatch to the residents of San Francisco, Stockton, Sacramento, and throughout, I think, Northern California.
Oh, very much so. It was, I try to say it was a combination between Macau, Chicago during Prohibition, and Las Vegas. It had all those elements in that one little tiny street that was filled with everything. And people from all over, my uncle is actually, who I heard about this, who was a farmer down in Fresno in the 1970s. When I told him I was living in Locke, he said, "Oh, I remember Locke. when he was going to UC Davis at the time, and this was back in the mid-20s or so. And he told me about going to Locke on a riverboat and saying how many people there were, and how vibrant it was, and cars were coming in both directions. There were lights going back and forth up and down Main Street. This place was just vibrant with all the excitement of the 20s at that time.
So then, how does that tie into the goal for the present for historical preservation? Is the goal to grow Locke in terms of population, or is it really to preserve the physical structure?
Well, we certainly don't want to grow the town per se, which is virtually impossible anyway because there's a moratorium on building structures.
Okay.
But, and certainly one of the missions of the Locke Foundation is historic preservation of the structures. That kind of overlaps into the Locke Management Association's arena because they are in charge of the physical part of town, especially common areas. The Locke Foundation itself, again, their main mission is to educate the public, but in that process, we hope to get better and better at educating the public and gathering archival materials and publishing and having lectures and having rotating displays in our Locke Boarding House Museum. So it takes a lot of money to do some of those things too, especially our oral history program. Those things are not cheap.
So how do you get support? Are the families that originally lived there, are they supporters? Are they dispersed throughout Northern California? Is that where you get a lot of support, or from historic families, or is it mostly people who are living there presently?
When you say support, are you talking about financial support?
Oh, there's two kinds, Every group has work support, who rolls up their sleeves and does it, and then financial support.
Yeah, well, the Locke Foundation is a 501c3 nonprofit, so we get no funding from any agency. Our primary source of funding is through staging events like our Locke Asian Pacific Spring Festival, which is coming up in the second Saturday in May.
Okay.
And we do have membership in the Locke Foundation. We have about 150 members who pay annual or lifetime fees and receive benefits like our newsletter and discounts and whatnot. We do have sponsorship that's generally tied to our events, so we lean hard on sponsors.
Okay.
So we operate on about a $30,000 a year budget. Support where the rubber meets the road is always volunteers. And it's just like other small towns, there's a handful of us that really do most of the work. And then as you go out from there, you get people that do a little bit less work. So that's okay. When we have our events, it does take quite a lot of, we bring in the local Boy Scouts, and we have some church support too.
Sure, I can imagine there. I mean, and I'm sure I know some of the communities lean and help each other up at the north end of the Delta also.
Yeah.
So I'm sure you get some.
Well, it's a delicate dance we have to do, because in 2015 was the 100th year anniversary of Locke. And during that time, of course, there was many conversations about how to proceed into the next 100 years. Because in all reality, unless there is greater emphasis on more people coming, more money coming into Locke, and businesses being able to stay in existence. Right now we only have essentially Al the Wops, which was a term that I don't know for your listeners, that was applied to the Italian immigrants coming in. It simply means without papers or without passport. Right. It was a very insultive term, particularly to the Italians. But that was the name of the bar. But that's, it's a delightful story, and to tell about how this in a fun place to come about. But really, if Al's was to be gone tomorrow, we would suffer tremendously because you wouldn't have hardly anybody coming in except for the people that we can bring in through the Locke Foundation and such. So
and there's a couple of other small businesses.
Well, you have some great studios, though.
Yeah,
like
we
that,
have
right?
we have the Moon Cafe, we have the China Gardens restaurant,
the River Road Art Gallery,
the River Road Art Gallery. But we need to have greater, and that's the reason something like this, the show, as well as the Locke Foundation, and even my book and such, we're really trying to get people's awareness, because it's people's awareness into the future. It's the more that Locke can attract people, and recognizing that it is on the landmark status, that this is someplace very special, then more awareness will lead to, I hope, to greater grants, to more possibilities of other businesses coming in right now. Into the future, because as now they're kind of stymied, and we really need to be able to have that balance between stabilizing and growth rather than the possibility of buildings continuing to deteriorate.
I think the listeners might find it interesting too that there is only one building in Locke that is not privately owned, and that's the Locke Boarding House Museum, which again is a unit of the California State Parks. All the other buildings on Main Street and the residential streets, excuse me, are privately owned, and it makes it very difficult to get funding.
Yeah. Well, also, Locke is situated, to the east of it is the Delta Meadows State Park, and it's a delightful place. We get many kayakers, many people come up there on the day. Even though it's a closed park at this point, people are still coming to it, as well as all of that area with the Sacramento River right there. It's a great spot to come over to. If you're coming for a day visit. And we really encourage people. We have a community garden as well as a community picnic area that we encourage people to come to, and to come out and have lunch, come out and walk around. There are many of us, like myself in town, who will serendipitously have conversations with people to tell them about Locke. And we personally, what did you have? You infected me.
We need to hear some St. James
Right.
Infirmary
No,
here.
I hope you're not getting what I had, but I know it's not for me at this point. So it's been a really, really rough, fluid, cold season.
Oh, hasn't it? Yeah.
So, how many visitors pass through Locke?
Well, in the Locke Boarding House Museum, it's between 7,500 and 8,500 a year.
That's a significant number. I mean, because you're doing this all on a volunteer basis. It's a very small community with limited resources.
Well, we get so many photography groups coming down, so many painting groups. We get tours that oftentimes Stuart and I will be the docents for to come around town. You can actually make arrangements with the Locke Foundation to have one of us do one of the other docents to do a tour with you on Locke with any kind of group.
That's lovely. So you had the big celebration in 2015, and then you do regular celebrations now. You're going to do something special for Chinese New Year?
Yes, our Chinese New Year, I'm saying ours because I know Stockton's is going to be on the 3rd of February. Ours is on February 17th from noon to 4 o'clock in Locke. At noon, we're going to have the lion dance, which is kind of fun. It's more than just the lion walking up and down the street. We actually bless each building, and that means hanging your lettuce down from the balconies with money on them, and the lion comes in and grabs a lettuce, and both kinds of lettuce. It chews up the lettuce, and it throws it into your building and blesses it for the rest of the year.
Okay.
We're going to have a martial arts demonstration and calligraphy, a tea presentation. We're going to have the Daloi Gambling House open and a demonstration on traditional Chinese gambling. And we're going to have some tours that day. So it'd be fun to come on down to Locke. It's all free.
That sounds like an awful lot of fun.
Yeah,
it is. It's a gas. Oh, yeah.
Do you really fill up for that event? Is it fill up?
We have.
Well, yeah, but you have to realize this is kind of new for us. We always had two bigger events in Locke. One is the Locke Asian Pacific Spring Festival that occurs in May. And then in October we have a fundraising event, which is, we can't rely on having that outside, so it's more of an indoor event. But we got tired of everybody saying, why does Locke not have a Chinese New Year? Well, it's always a matter of volunteers. Well, we had a lot of people step forward this year, and we decided, well, we're going to go for it. And there will also be a Locke Chinese New Year celebration in the town of Isleton on the 3rd of February, too.
Okay.
And that's going to be a lot of fun for them, too. So, good reason to get out on the Delta.
Yeah, and February is actually a beautiful month because sometimes the days can be really sunny and it can be a little bit warmer than you think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Winter's behind us by then.
Right, especially in the north end of the Delta. And May is beautiful, too. May can be quite warm. Even
March, it's all gorgeous. You know, it's always been every month of the year has its own special beauty for the Delta. You know, the vastness of the skies, the changing of the light, that Delta breeze, whether it be in the the hot summer months of when we get that breeze that comes up and cools things, or just even in the winter when things are rustling about. It's absolutely, as a photographer, I highly recommend it. Come on out.
So Stuart, how did you end up becoming involved with this and moving to Locke?
Well, in the early 70s, I moved from Sacramento. I was raised in Sacramento, to a little farm, little pear orchard across from Cortland. I was in college, and I had a bunch of college roommates, so it was like a big party. But at the time, I was also painting, and my roommate was a photographer, and we would go all over the Delta. We kept going to Locke, and at that time, as James's book shows, his Bitter Melon, Locke really was Chinese. I mean, it was almost 100%. And it was a fascinating place. We kept going back there for painting and photographing, and then in about 1980, I met a wonderful woman in Locke at the River Road Art Gallery named Connie King, who's like our Locke mother. And I submitted some of my work there and joined the gallery, and when I had an opportunity, I moved to a little apartment. It's actually an apartment in the back of the house that I eventually purchased and live in now.
Okay.
So that's how I got there.
Okay, that's a wonderful story. It's a wonderful story.
I'm blessed to have had that chain of events occur in my life.
Yeah,
certainly.
That's wonderful. There are stories about how the Chinese immigrants ended up in Locke. Were they excluded from other communities in the Delta? Is that how it was created to an extent?
No, actually, it's an interesting point because as Stuart was saying earlier, the Chinese, of course, came over for the gold rush.
Right.
And then the building of the Transcontinental Railroad employed a number of the Chinese in large work gangs. Those large work gangs were so successful, and they took notice of that in the Delta, and to be able to reclaim the Delta, which, as your listeners probably know, is a inverted alluvial fan. Essentially, you have, unlike, say, the Mississippi Delta or the Nile Delta, you have a single body of water coming down that feeds into then a whole series of things that outlet into the ocean. The Delta is quite different. You have a narrow opening at the Golden Gate Bridge and then Carquinez Straits where all the water kind of backs up. So this was all throughout this whole area at that time in the 1860s was a giant marsh. And the Chinese were about the only people local landowners who could get to come in here and actually work in all this mud and yuck. And they essentially were responsible for building the initial small levees, and then once the levees were furtherly built by the clamshell diggers and such to build up, and then you had the islands that were being created by these levees. So the Chinese then were here in pretty large numbers to be able to take these jobs, to do the farming and such. They were tenant farmers. Another great thing that happened to accentuate this was in the 1870s, what was called the driving out. Because the Chinese, if it hadn't been for the animosity and then the later 1882 Exclusion Act, would have been one of the largest non-European groups here on the West Coast, all the way to Idaho and such. But during the 1870s, the Chinese were purposely driven to essentially the western coast, San Francisco. And so And even in San Francisco, they suffered quite violent reactions to them.
Right.
The Delta was actually one of the unique places of where the Chinese felt somewhat safe. That the landowners here deeply appreciated their efforts and knew that they were a very dependable workforce, and so they protected them somewhat. And in many ways, even though they still couldn't buy, land. This was, of course, the 1914 Alien Land Act that forbid the Chinese from owning land. So the Delta, that's one of the things that makes Locke so unique, is it's the Delta, really, with the Chinese involvement in it, that, in a sense, along with the Transcontinental Railroad, really propelled California into the modern age. Because even with the Transcontinental Railroad, you had very few ways of getting anything that the East Coast wanted.
Right.
The East Coast did want a lot of what was grown in the Delta, particularly asparagus. It was a huge commodity for the West Coast. And so you had, due to the Chinese laborers and the farmers producing things that the East Coast wanted, which then gave California the finances, in a sense, to keep moving forward and to expand the railroad into the Central Valley. But again, it's the specialness of the Delta and the Chinese involvement with them, with the Delta, that really, worked to all of California's favor.
Interesting. Very interesting. What would be lost if the Delta tunnels would be built?
Oh, boy.
What would be lost for Locke?
My mind.
Well, the thing is, I'm going to jump in here because, Locke and Walnut Grove are under the current wording with the Delta Protection Commission's language of their proposals to have 2 intakes that would divert water from the Sacramento to the Delta Stewardship Council.
Let me help you clarify here. You mean the Cal Water Fix wording, right?
Yeah, the Cal Water Fix wording,
right? Okay.
Which would then say that there would be these 2 intake facilities in both Locke and Walnut Grove. If that happens, if the construction of those happen, it's the end of Locke. It's already, the construction of those would involve a multi-year project with heavy trucks and pile drivers and cement makers and
moving
everything.
The road,
moving everything. Locke would cease to exist. We wouldn't be able to live there. The noise alone would drive all of us away. So that is a real threat.
What would happen to the boathouse? The boathouse is historical also. Yes.
Well, I think it would actually be removed.
It would be removed. It would be gone. The proposals are to have that removed.
Yeah, and then the structures themselves on Main Street. We're talking about 14 years of construction here, of constant pile driving, trucks.
Right. Shaking the road.
Locke is, all the buildings are made out of wood, and they all have what's called balloon framing, which is essentially a typical Locke building is your business was downstairs and your residence was upstairs, and the downstairs had a glass front and the upstairs was stable. Everything tended to lean sideways and in because of the levee. So there's no doubt that if this project went through, it would shake the town down. Plus they want to build a big forebay behind the town, which is mammoth. So it's out of the question. And the reason that they want to be, putting the tunnels up here rather than farther down is because the water is cleaner up here. Requires less purification.
Less treatment.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful Sacramento River water. Over the years as the project's unfolded, have you had much interaction with the state? I mean, have they approached the residents of Locke? Has anyone tried to make peace or talk with you about right-of-ways or eminent domain or any of those issues, or have you just been ignored in the process?
We've been ignored, and it's been a tragedy. It wasn't until actually last year that I was unaware of these proposals for these intakes, and it was just at a conversation in the post office with Barbara Daly, who's part of the North Delta Cares, suggested I might take a look at some of the material that she had about these intakes. The county, the state, nobody has ever come down to us and said, these things are real. This is what we're proposing for this area. We have the drawings. We have the specifics that we want to do for these, the amount of water we want to take from these two intakes. Nobody's ever come anywhere and said anything to us that this construction project was even a possibility for us.
See, it's very interesting to us at Restore the Delta when we find out that people still didn't know, but they didn't. I mean, one of the interesting things about the sign campaign we did, which started in, 2013, was that we were getting phone calls from people who spoke other languages that lived in the Delta, who wanted to know what the signs were all about, because they never heard from anybody, either from the state. So has the association and the Historical Society, have you tried to interact with Cal Water Fix? Have you done comments? What happened after you learned about the project?
Well, there certainly was a series of meetings that James has been very faithful in attending those meetings, as much as far as them listening to the community, and especially the long-time families out there that come to voice their concerns. James might be able to address that better than me.
Well, here, let me jump into the story. Yeah, from that one meeting I had, then I started to attend the Delta Stewardship Council's meeting. I was unaware of all this. I've been following, the Restore the Delta quite faithfully and such, but I didn't know this particular aspect that we were so potentially threatened in Locke. From that, at that meeting, I, along with many of my other residents, as well as people who lived in Walnut Grove, I thought made very passionate and very smart arguments to say to the Delta Stewardship Council not to include this language, to give us more time, to get more people to comment about this. They went ahead and approved it. At that point, then, I personally took it on to then start to do something. So I started posting a lot of things on Facebook, informing people about what was happening, and I started a petition, simply saying, we have to stop the destruction of Locke and Walnut Grove. The Delta Stewardship Council, send them emails, call them. And now at this point, I have well over 1,500 signatures of people signing on to this and saying, we too were uninformed. We do not want this to happen.
Yeah, it is amazing how they skipped over the community. We turned in final comments today based on the draft plan EIR. Going through the same process with you. And, this is our second time down the road. They're looking at plan amendments. We're involved in litigation from the first time around in 2012, 2013, which we won, but now is up for appeal. And basically, our policy analyst, Tim Stroshane, he really came up with the decision that we were going to call for the actual abolition of the Delta Stewardship Council when we went through the plan EIR with the amendments. Not, and we want to really stress this, not because we're some crazy anti-government organization, far from it. We believe actually enforcement of laws, especially for water quality and quantity and standards. But the whole entire problem is they admit in this plan that they have no legal authority to do any enforcement. Their whole existence is to make recommendations, and because they're so heavily influenced by the governor's office, that being a member of the public and going and interacting with them, you get absolutely no result. They absolutely refuse to listen. It was very clear last year when we were all attending those meetings, the scoping meetings for this Delta Plan amendment, that they felt really burdened by having to listen to the public.
Exactly. Yet they appear to be the gatekeeper.
Right.
And unfortunately, we, James and I and a lot of other folks, were using their contact number as, if you have any questions or comments, go to Delta Stewardship, which is,
Right.
I regret doing.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I tried to have, I made an outreach on Facebook saying to all poets, painters, photographers, writers, send examples of what you have done to the Delta Stewardship Council. Show them the importance that you've been so affected by Locke that you've created a piece of artwork. And I'm sure they did, so, but they seemed they're not concerned about us at this point.
No, and it's very, very sad, and even if people were secondary, they're certainly not concerned about the fish or wildlife that they're also supposed to be protecting. You can sometimes understand if you put communities a little bit on the side because you think you're going to gain something there, but that doesn't seem to be the end goal either. One of the things that really struck us in terms of outreach, so for the last year, we've reminded them that they have ignored really important state laws around the human right to water and what is required in the state in terms of doing outreach to environmental justice communities. You're surrounded by communities where half the people in your community do not speak English. As
well,
their
it's like
first language.
California as a whole.
Exactly.
Locke is no longer a Chinese community, but it's California. We have a large Hispanic community.
Right.
We have folks like Stuart and myself who are, I'm retired at this point. But it's California. This is who we are.
That's right.
It's who we should celebrate. Nobody's reaching out to anybody.
No, and even after giving them the critique that if you want to do this process right, you should go back and be serving notice to these groups and to people. It never happened.
Indeed.
It never happened.
They put out this tome that they bury these alternatives in, and it's like impossible for a normal human being to even find these things.
That's right.
Thank goodness we have people like Barbara Daly who are digging through this stuff and finding it.
That's right.
It's like, what?
That's right.
I was going to say, if you do come down to Locke, you'll see the petition that we have going in the boarding house museum. Please sign it.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Every voice helps.
We've done a few of our own over the years. We delivered 10,000 signatures at one point to Metropolitan Water District in Southern California. And, you keep at it and you keep adding it up because people realize it. And we've had a critical mass. I mean, from our end, we definitely see most Californians don't like the project. Even if they like the governor, they don't like the project. Yeah. They see it as his one act of foolishness. Yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah.
So, what do you look forward put the tunnels aside. If we win, that we'll win. It'll take some time. It'll take some effort. If you put that aside, what do you see as the future for Locke, and what would you like to see as the future for preserving Locke?
Well, I myself would like to see the buildings stabilized. I've always told people, we have a lot of politicking, and Locke is known for being a very bohemian town, and a lot of interesting things and interesting people live and occur in the town of Locke. But I say, as long as the town physically remains like it is, I'll be happy. So,
and what would that take to make it physically stable? That's.
Boy, it depends on where one wants to begin. You have to start with the foundation first and stabilize. New sidewalks, stabilize the foundation, straighten out the buildings, repair the facades. There's already Sacramento County has put quite a bit of money into fire suppression. We have a good, thorough fire suppression system on Main Street, and we do have a new sewer system there too. Unfortunately, some folks that live in Locke don't repair or restore their buildings, and those buildings might just fall in on them. I don't want Locke to end up being like a Bodie. So, and it could.
Okay.
And we've come close to that.
Okay.
So.
Okay.
Well, ideally, I'd like Locke to be there for my great-grandchildren for another, say, 100 years. And like any of the landmarks that we have in California, that Locke is one of them. How to make that happen is going to be an ongoing, everyday concern. And the first thing that, for me, is to have people come and visit. And I think that's also, and I'm going to do an outreach to all of your listeners who have Chinese ancestry, to come to Locke, get involved. This is really your story. This is the story of the Chinese in America, and it's a really powerful story. Take whatever talents you have, if you're a writer or if you want to make a movie about the experience of the Chinese in California or in America, however you want to do it, it's your story. Take with it, get with it, and run with it. It's an amazing place.
That's wonderful. That's
it is.
wonderful.
It's a very fertile place. I very much concur with James. Here's James and I, a couple of white guys here advocating for Locke, and really the roots go deep, deep, deep into the Chinese community. So, yeah, we encourage. Unfortunately, we give tours, and we see a lot of the younger Asian kids, and they could learn a lot more about their history and culture and their ancestry. Boy, Locke is a great place to do it, to see at least the 20th century.
I have to tell you, one of the projects for us for doing the radio show Delta Flows is to really encourage people, because there was a diaspora from the Stockton Chinese community into the Bay Area as well, is for people to really kind of come back and claim their Delta roots.
Yeah, their legacy.
And it seems like that would work really well for preserving Locke into the future. So we hope we can help you put the call out for that. We'd like to see
right now.
Having younger people coming and working with you and building for the future of Locke, I think would be an absolutely wonderful thing.
It would be.
All right.
Yes.
That's mine. Yeah.
Well, good. I think then we are probably about finished today, unless you have any other closing comments or anything you'd like to add.
Just come to Locke.
Yeah.
Enjoy it.
Yeah.
It'll blow your mind. People they take a look down Main Street and they cannot believe where they're at. And then go to the back of town too.
Yeah.
That's right. And remember, if you go to El the Wops, bring cash. So
Bring cash.
Yes, then no one will take your card and lock. So, all right, real good. Thank you so much for joining me today. We really appreciate
Thank you, Barbara. Really appreciate all your work.
Wish you luck and success with your upcoming festivities.
Thank you.
Thank you.